Good to see you again. Your reaction to what Mr. Sunak had to say there in saying no, no, no?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that apology is what comes before reparatory justice. And part of the reason that people don't want to apologise for slavery is that they don't want to have to pay reparations. I mean, we have a historical precedent for this, actually, which everyone in the UK knows about, which is the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles was where Germany was forced both to apologise and take acknowledgement for the First World War, and after that, was forced to pay a huge amount of reparations. They were even called reparations. And it both resented the fact that it had to pay reparations, but also resented the fact that it had to acknowledge what it had done, or what it was perceived to have done with regards to the First World War. And that tension led into the Second World War. So Britain has no historical problem with accepting reparations from other states that it believes have done something wrong. However, when it comes to paying reparations, it becomes a very different story.
However, Femi, those reparations from Germany bankrupted the country and paved the way for Hitler.
Well, I think saying the reparations paved the way for Hitler is not necessarily, is a bit disingenuous, because at the end of the day, there was a number of factors apart from hyperinflation and financial kind of ruin, which led to Hitler's rise. One of them, obviously, being remarkable amounts of xenophobia and hatred of certain minority ethnic groups, something which has strong parallels today in many parts of the world. But nonetheless, Britain isn't poor, and paying, I mean, if Britain were to actually pay the amount that it has gained historically from colonialism and slavery, it would be an awful lot of money, and it would lead to Britain having to kind of perhaps reel back from some of the excessive living that people at the top of society indulge in. But Britain has a lot of very, very, very wealthy people. Some of them very, very, very wealthy because of the slave trade. Some of them very, very wealthy because of colonialism. And obviously, it is a country which has benefited hugely from this history. And Britain would not bankrupt itself if it were to give some degree of reparatory justice. It would, however, take a lot of money to actually repair for some of these historic wrongs.
Rafe Haidel Manku, it's time for the British government to say sorry and to pay up.
Yeah, there are so many historical inaccuracies with Femi's argument there, but let's just go to the main one. The Treaty of Versailles was in 1919, 1 year after the First World War. Now, were we having this discussion in 1807 or in 1808, a year after the British abolished the slave trade, I absolutely would agree with Femi that we must apologise and must pay reparations, because the victims of the horrors of slavery were alive and obviously, deserving of huge damages. But it's not 1807 or 1907 or 2007. Over 200 years have passed since the abolition of slavery, and we're talking about the descendants of slaves today in the Caribbean who are 6 or 7 generations separated between their slave ancestors. And in what sense are they actually victims, and in what sense are they deserving of reparations? Because, it's an uncomfortable truth that few people want to actually point out. But from, whether it's Britain or the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves today have a far better and far higher quality of life than if their ancestors had stayed in Africa. And that's an indisputable fact. Most former colonies are now actually middle-income countries. The GDP of the Bahamas is higher than Portugal, which was the greatest of the slave states. And whether you're looking at, Barbados or Antigua and Barbuda and Kitts and Nevis, former British slave colonies have a higher quality of life, according to the UN Human Development Index, than Brazil or Mexico or many countries of South America. So, you have to ask in what way has the British Empire disadvantaged those countries. But to put it another way, let's compare the Caribbean to West Africa, which is where most slaves came from. Now, the GDP in Benin, where a lot of slaves came from, is $1,400 a year, $1,400. In Barbados, it's $17,000. Over 10 times higher. Life expectancy in Benin is 62. In Barbados, it's 79. There isn't a single country in the Caribbean which isn't at least 4 or 5 times better. And I think Muhammad Ali put it best. Now, Muhammad Ali, great campaigner for African American rights. And, when he left Zaire after his rumble in the jungle with George Foreman, someone asked him what he thought of Africa. And he said, "Thank God my granddaddy got on that boat," because as bad as slavery is, for those who were enslaved, had they stayed in Africa, the people today calling for reparations would have far and more dramatically poorer lives.
And Femi, what about those African slavers who sold human beings on the open market?
Well, before I get to your question, let me just address some of Rafi's inaccuracies. At the end of the day, it's interesting that you end your discussion on the topic of Zaire, which obviously now is known as the Congo. The Congo is one of the key examples of European colonialism damaging Africa to an extent where it's poorer than the Caribbean. The fact that the Caribbean is doing better than Africa at the moment is not a representation of the beneficence of Europeans in taking Africans to the Caribbean to enslave them. It's a representation of the fact that after Congo elected its first democratic leader, Patrice Lumumba, he was killed by France and by Belgium. The UK was also involved. His body was dissolved in a tub of acid, and a dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, was installed, who robbed the country for 30 years and hid all his money in Swiss bank accounts in Europe. So Europe is very, very, very complicit in where Africa is today. Colonialism and neocolonialism have led to a situation in which Africa is so poor that the Caribbean, despite being many, many, many magnitudes poorer than the West, because of the history it's had with the West, as you say, is doing better than a lot of African states. However, the fact that it's 1 year or 300 years does not matter if it's traceable.
Femi.
MPs like Richard Drax, Richard Drax knows where his wealth comes from, and if he can still be massively rich off the back of slavery 6 or 7 generations later, why is it then hard to understand that Caribbeans, part of the reason they're poorer than the West today, is something that happened 6 or 7 generations ago? A year after the abolition of slavery, the slave owners were paid off. The slaves never got any money, and those slave owners are rich today.
Now, Femi, I'm sympathetic to your suggestion of an apology. I don't see why not. After all, a terrible human crime was committed. However, reparations is just silly, isn't it? Where do you start? Do you start with the African countries who actually sold people, prepared them in cages in order to be shipped abroad? And also, do the Italians pay reparations for the Roman Empire? Do the Swedes pay reparations for the Vikings? Do the English pay reparations for the Irish potato famine? Where does this end?
Well, the Irish potato famine was a pretty horrific piece of history where England just basically shipped many tons of food out of a starving state, where people were dying of starvation just because they didn't respect them as human beings. So there could definitely be talk of something there. However, especially given the fact that Ireland is now a separate state, but things are traceable, some things are not. If I could point to someone and say, you're the direct descendant of a Roman kind of gladiator-owning, slave-owning family, and this is the direct descendant of someone else who was who was one of these slaves, and draw a clear link between the reason you're wealthy and the reason that person is poor being linked to historical injustice, great. The thing about modern, and it is modern in comparison with the Roman Emperor, it is modern in comparison with the Ottoman Emperor, it's very modern. Modern slavery, the transatlantic slave trade in a comparative sense, is that we still know who is wealthy because of it, and we still know that these countries are poor in a large way because of it. We know. Okay. We know that the descendants of these people are wealthy, and we know that their personal private wealth is built off slavery. Richard Drax inherited a plantation recently. They still own the plantation in Barbados, and he inherited it. It's very clear who the beneficiaries of this are.
Okay, Femi, sorry to stop you. The clock's against us. Briefly, if you can, Rafe, final thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, firstly, Britain wasn't involved in the Congo at all. If you look around the world, the regions of the world with the most stable countries, they're always former British colonies. But look, the idea that slavery was somehow fueling Britain and the empire is a complete nonsense. That the slavery contributed to the British economy the same amount that hops and brewing did. And no one says that beer built the British Empire or built the Industrial Revolution. It's long been discounted, the idea that somehow slavery was a huge benefit to Britain. In fact, you know, with the 40% of GDP that Britain paid to free the slaves, and with the 13% of Royal Navy resources enforcing the abolition of the slave trade globally, Britain actually ended up paying more to stop slavery than it did from getting slavery. And out of a population of millions, there were only 3,000 slave owners. So why should the millions of people in Britain today whose ancestors lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom, why should they pay reparations? You know, what about all the people from the Caribbean living in Britain? Why should they pay reparations to people in the Caribbean? What about 16% of the population who live abroad now, who live from abroad, who now live in Britain? Why should they pay reparations?
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, well, there we go.
Well, yes, of course, we could do hours on this, but my sincere thanks to Rafe Heidel-Manku and Femi Nylander for a very vibrant debate.